We talked about rigour, but how much rigour is enough? There's danger in being over rigorous, and there's danger in being under rigorous. So how do you figure out the level of rigour that you need in the quality management and quality assurance process? Well, essentially, you look at the level of uncertainty and ambiguity, and if these are high, then you need a low level of rigour in order to allow your experts to figure out what to do. When the level of uncertainty and ambiguity reduce, so essentially you know what it is and you know how to do it, then you can afford to have a quality management system that is quite rigorous, because but quite rigorous in that it has predetermined processes and predetermined practices and sequences of how to do things, because we know how to do it. So you can have a quality management system that's quite prescriptive. But when, as I say, when the situation is highly ambiguous or highly uncertain, then you need to loosen all that off to allow your experts to exercise their judgment. Now, what does this mean? I'll give you some examples of what this means. If you are examining a specification, now normally in software development and pretty much everything else, you might come out with a specification or a design or something like that, and this has to be reviewed, this has to be checked. It's very rare that you produce a specification without some form of checking whether it's any good. Now, the least rigorous way of checking a specification is a simple peer review. It's just you give it to an expert and say, what do you think? That's a peer review. It's not very rigorous. You probably miss a whole lot of errors as well. And then next you can go through, say, a walkthrough, you can go through some sort of a formal inspection, a checklist inspection, or you can do a Fagan inspection, which is a prescribed kind of inspection. That goes through the specification with a fairly high level of rigour. Now, that's probably about as good as you can do. Another example is evaluating the customer experience. Now, ISO 9001 does require that you determine how satisfied the customer is with the product or service that you're producing. You have to evaluate the customer service. Now, how can you do this? Now, the least rigorous way is you simply talk to the customer and you report conversations. Okay, it's anecdotal evidence, and this is very, very unrigorous, but very cheap to collect. The highest level of rigour is you actually would do quite an extensive survey with statistical validity and all sorts of things like that. And that is pretty expensive, but it also provides you with fairly good information. Now, choose the activity to match the required level of rigour. Higher quality assurance rigour costs time, money and resources, and you don't want to spend that if you don't have to. So use the lowest level of rigour necessary, but no lower. And don't pay for what you don't need, which is the normal thing, you know. Take the least effort. In quality assurance, there is practical limits to determining the qualities of a finished product, because products of any reasonable level of complexity, and software has to be considered reasonably complex, there is a limit to what you can determine about the product simply by looking at it once it's done. It does require a certain amount of insight into how it was produced. So you have to have some insight into the software development process. So if you're looking at measures of quality, now a good example with software is it fails. Okay, we've got a fault. Where did that fault come from? Having worked in technical support and trying to debug programs, I can tell you it can be quite difficult to determine where the actual fault came from. And that was with procedural code, which is reasonably okay to go and diagnose. But now we're getting into event-driven systems and collaborating systems where you can get some very obscure faults. So there are some difficulties there. There are limits to what you can do, but we do have to try. Now, there is a body of theory, it's actually called agency theory, that applies to management. And it works reasonably well. And what it among other things, what it says is that you have what you have to do depends on your visibility into some things. If the outcomes are easy to measure, then that's the fastest, easiest, cheapest thing to do. You measure the outcomes. You do this in situations where it's very, very clear what the outcome is and is required to be. With software, that's not true. A lot of the time we can't actually measure some qualities of the software once it's been produced. And so we have to then go in to measure the software during its production, and we have to do something about controlling how the software is produced. So we have to prescribe some of the processes as well as measure the interim products as we're going through and the end product.